And go down to page 22. What is this section called aggravating circumstances? What does that entail?
So this section is for disciplinary decision making, right? It's one of the objective things I use to decide, okay, what exactly is what's the appropriate level of discipline? So as you can see, what it kind of determines is the history of complaints. And I know Mr. Dunbar asked earlier, why did we arbitrarily pick February 16th of 21? What I did was I asked Lieutenant Bell to go all the way back during my tenure. I don't really, chiefs make decisions in different ways and for different reasons, right? So I don't want to include any adverse discipline that may have happened before I got here. So that's the reason for that time frame. But it's basically a list, and it in accordance with progressive discipline, you'll see a lot of entries there on there that say unfounded, because our guardian tracking system also, that's one of the things we want to catch too, right? Not only or what the officers are doing wrong, but when it's unfounded, we also capture commendations. So that's kind of what that is. The aggravating circumstances kind of sets out what the progressive discipline was leading up to this.
Now, of all these bullet points that we have on this exhibit, the last one is 9/14/23. That's the one that was pending, that is the basis of why we're here today, correct?
Yes, sir.
So before this case, there were 12 other instances under at least your commandership where you were reviewing the job performance of Officer Akers.
Correct.
I'd like to turn your attention, because some of them, as you just mentioned, were unfounded, and some led to a 30-hour suspension, which is part of Exhibit 7, but we'll just stick to this exhibit right now. If you can recall what the 11/4/21 incident was that led to a 30-hour suspension.
Yes, sir. So Officer Akers had gone to basically a mental health call, right? A mental health crisis call. It was a husband and wife. The wife had called in on the husband, as I recall. We ended up doing an emergency detention on him based on him meeting the criteria for one. After the officer left to transport him, Officer Akers was still there. In his interaction with the wife, she mentioned to him that her husband had some weapons in the house, and she wanted to get those. She just wanted to get rid of those weapons, right? I think, out of memory, I believe he gave her kind of a couple of options. One is you can take them to a pawn shop. Otherwise, I know somebody who might be interested in them. That person that was interested in him happened to ultimately turned out to be his father-in-law. And so he kind of brokered a purchase between his father-in-law and the female that was on scene to basically purchase those weapons. And the purchase was made. We found that. Was there a complaint made? Well, yes, sir. When the husband returned after he was released from his emergency detention, yes, he made a complaint to the department. I'm sure it went to the summary level. Probably a sergeant took it. But yes, he made the complaint saying my weapons are gone. She's telling me that the officer brokered a sale between her and his father-in-law, and he wanted his weapons back. And that's what led to the 30-hour suspension? Yes, sir. Okay. Lacking of professionalism. That's not what you would expect an officer under your shift to do, would you? No, absolutely not. That's unethical. It's improper. That's a horrible decision to make, to get involved to that degree. The very first incident that you're involved in with Officer Akers was one that occurred on February 16th of 2021. Do you recall that one where there was a discourtesy incident? Off the top of my head, no, sir. But it did result in a written reprimand? Yeah, yes, sir. And sometimes if they're really stuck on whether or not to push it up from the summary level to me, sometimes they'll just say, Chief, what do you think about this? That was probably one of those things where, based on the circumstances, I was like, I think it would be appropriate to issue a written reprimand. If it says at my request, that's typically what happened. Then we had the incident of 7/26/21, which is part of Exhibit 8, but we'll just stay with this since it's your conclusions.
that also had to do with Miss Trevino. And that was where we had seen some video previously where she's at a storage facility, and she and Officer Akers have an encounter. Do you recall that incident?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. What did you find disturbing about that encounter?
I found a lot of things disturbing. When I first watched the video, tactically speaking, it was horrible. I thought the officer, based on what the call was and what the scene looked like when he got there, put himself in danger.
You're talking about Officer Akers?
Yes, sir, which of course concerned me. I know as I went through the video, I believe Lieutenant Bell and I can't remember who else was there, but essentially I hadn't been here that long. But basically my first question was, is this actually how we're training officers to respond to calls? And I think they were equally, I use the word mortified, right, about the scene. I know we've watched it a couple times, and going back through it, I mean, it's tactically, it's not acceptable at all.
What criticism do you have specifically of Officer Akers as he engaged with Ms. Trevino? Sure.
So a lot's been said about the time of night, the fact that it was closed. I believe there was somebody that called in and said it was a possible burglary. He didn't have a backup unit on scene. I think you hear him on his body-worn camera when he starts to physically engage with Ms. Trevino. He actually calls for a second at that point. Approaching it, the car, he was at a disadvantage because the headlights of the car were on. Right? The door was open, but you couldn't see. You know, it's very difficult to see what's going on behind those headlights. So instead of driving up right next to the car, if you saw, there was a cut in the building, right? So if he pulled over to the left, he could have got out of his vehicle, had his vehicle cover on the right, and had that wall cover on the left and wait for backup. So you saw some of the things that he got himself into. When he approached her, there's no way he could have seen if anyone was behind the car, in the car. And then you'll notice as he engages with her, there's a vehicle that pulls up behind the scene, right? And I think at that point, I don't think he'd called the second yet, or maybe he had just called it. So tactically, you know, we're taught. I've been doing this for a long time, and you're taught from the very beginning. You don't push a disadvantage, right? You create an advantage for yourself. So that was a long discussion between me and the command staff. Actually, it actually expanded out to both patrol lieutenants, and I asked them, I said, you know, based on what are you guys recommending? What do you think? And of course it came out, you know, like we think a written reprimand is appropriate with some follow-up training and tactics and de-escalation and legally justified and all that kind of stuff. So again, I deferred to the command staff on that, and I said, okay, but this is unacceptable tactics for anybody.
What, if anything, did de-escalation have to do, or that it should have been done or utilized with regard to that?
Well, yeah. So he forced himself into a situation where, you know, he started walking towards the vehicle. She followed. She shut the door. Everything natural that somebody that's doing something wrong is going to do, right? So his response was good. Once he engaged with her, it was kind of like a yelling match back and forth, right? So before your backup gets there and you're in a spot like that, yeah, retreat, de-escalate if you have to tactically. What ended up happening that nobody's talked about before, one of the basically what the written reprimand was for is that I believe Sergeant Scott and Lieutenant Bell both touched on it maybe, is it wasn't for excessive use of force. It was actually for inadequate use of force, because when you start to use force, you're supposed to complete it in the manner that you've been trained. And what happened was he actually handcuffed Ms. Trevino, and it created a situation where the handcuffs were around his microphone cord. So if you saw how close he was and he didn't disengage, that was one of the reasons. It's hard to see in the video, and so I asked the investigators at the time. I was like, "What is going on here? He's close and he can't disengage." I believe that was one of Ms. Trevino's biggest complaints too. Is like, well, he was on me and he wouldn't disengage from me. And I believe Lieutenant Bell actually explained to her, well, you know, he handcuffed you, but the radio cord, microphone cord was entangled in that handcuffing. So it's kind of like creating, if you're going to use force, it's required on us to use the least amount necessary, right? But it's also incumbent upon us to do it correctly.
And as far as the type of training, how did you determine what type of training you needed to have?
It was a group discussion between the command staff members and me, because I was not satisfied. I was not ready to just say, okay, here's your written reprimand, go back on the street. I wanted to make sure that he was given the appropriate training for the deficiencies on that particular call.
And is it somewhat unusual to have the lieutenant go with the officer who's being reprimanded and make sure they actually go to the courts?
Yes. And when that was not a requirement of mine, but I think Lieutenant Bell felt like, hey, he knew I was serious. He knew that I was disturbed by the call and how it was handled, right? I just wanted to make sure that department-wide, that's not what we were training our officers to do, that we were training our officers to not put themselves in danger, right? I'm saying that for Pat's sake, too. I don't want to see any officer put themselves in a situation where they get hurt because they don't have a backup or they use the incorrect tactics, right? And you don't want, we're arresting somebody, like he was putting Miss Trevino in custody, but we don't want her to get injured either. And so if you do it incorrectly, the higher chance that both of them could get injured, right? So it was just tactically not handled well at all.
And this specific de-escalation training was for the incident, which I'll refer to as the first incident with Ms. Trevino.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
And so the reason we're here today is the second incident from a disciplinary standpoint with Ms. Trevino that occurred on September the 6th of 2023.
That's correct, sir. This is kind of, to me, I'll just use my term. I won't put in anyone else's mouth, but this is like textbook progressive discipline, right? You're supposed to look at it and say, okay, what's the least amount of discipline I can apply here to correct the behavior, short term and long term. There was some talk earlier about what matters. How far back does it matter? But you can see in the dates here and the string that it does.
Now, this document, which is City of Braunfels Exhibit Number 1, you're the author of this document?
I'm the author of this document, yes, sir. This would be the actual notice of indefinite suspension. So it looks a lot like the notice of predisciplinary hearing, but this section is actually added after I determine, okay, this is the appropriate discipline, in my opinion. This section is actually added at that point.
And after the bullet points that are under aggravating circumstances, there's another paragraph. Could you read that into the record?
It says, the above listed history of complaints and dispositions illustrate to me that you have been provided numerous opportunities, including summary level counseling, training, written reprimands, and temporary suspensions, to alter the negative behaviors documented within. This constitutes a complete failure to respond to the progressive disciplinary principles practiced by both the department's first-line supervisors as well as the command staff.
And that was your personal opinion?
Yes, sir.
If we move down to the next page, let's actually go to 23, where it talks about rules and regulations that were violated in the Braunfels Police Department. Much has been made. We've talked about this today. NPD policy and procedure, professional standards of conduct, restrictions on behavior, H, personal use of police power. What facts did you use to determine that those allegations for that particular policy were violated?
Basically everything from in-car video, watching the body-worn camera, reading the responses that Pat had to the questions. So basically it was a totality of everything in the investigation. Basically led to me sustaining that allegation.
Now, with regard to the fact that this last sentence says, in all other cases, officers shall summon an on-duty police personnel and supervisor in cases where there is a personal involvement that would reasonably require law enforcement intervention.
Correct.
Now, he did, and when I talk about Mr. Akers, did call for a backup officer and a supervisor.
He did, yes, sir.
But what did he do after they arrived?
He went back up to the top and he used his police powers to resolve a personal grievance for something that was not in the exception section there, which is basically the exception talks about self-defense actions to prevent injury, and then when a serious offense has been committed. I think we've established fail to signal intent or allegedly failing to signal intent is not a serious offense.
How many years have you been a police officer?
34. 34. This is my 34th year.
34 years. Have you ever arrested someone for failing to use a signal to change lane?
I have not.
The real reason, and we all know it, that he arrested...
Objection. We all know it. This is a sidebar. Don't
Yeah,
state
rephrase
counsel.
the question, please.
Do you believe that Officer Akers arrested Ms. Trevino because she flipped him the bird?
That and the fact that he had a history with her, a negative history, yes, sir. I think it was a combination of those things. That's based on not my speculation or subjectivity. It's actually based on his answers to the questions that Lieutenant Bell posed to him.
And did you, in fact, have a meeting with him prior to your making your final determination?
Yes, sir. I had a meeting with him and Mr. Dunbar both.
What was his explanation for why he arrested Trevino on September the 6th, 2023?
Well, basically, the contention was that he didn't arrest, right? I think Mr. Dunbar asked me some questions if I'd ever heard of the term unarrest, and I said yes. I first heard of that in 1987 in the police academy, and I think his contention was that there's no such thing. And I said, well, it's a thing, right? It happens in law enforcement. You arrest somebody, and they get unarrested for whatever reason, like this case right here, right? It's clear. You can see on the video, he said, you are under arrest for failing to signal lane change. She thinks she's under arrest, right? She's screaming, you're arresting me for this, you're arresting me for this, right? Just because you end up unarresting her doesn't mean that the arrest didn't happen, right? It clearly happened.
And the fact that Sergeant Scott was out there, what part did that play in his eventual outcome?
Well, I think that's the whole reason that the policy states that, right? If you deviate from those accepted circumstances, you call a supervisor out there, right? And it's for the exact reason that Sergeant Scott arrived and took the actions that he took, right? As soon as he found out who that was, he was confused. He didn't connect the names, right? Trevino and Sams. But as soon as he found out what was going on, he realized that he's violating this policy, right? Just because he has him on scene, that's the reason he's on scene, is to make sure he doesn't violate the policy, right? So Sergeant Scott did exactly what his responsibility as a sergeant is to do.
And was that within the rules and regulations of the City of Braunfels Police Department for Sergeant Scott to tell Officer Akers to turn his mic off?
Yes, sir.
And why was that?
Basically, at that point, he realized that he was now into a personnel issue. So he turned the mic off to clarify. I believe, as he testified today, I believe he was clarifying. Okay, this is what you're arresting her for. There's nothing else here. She's got a driver's license. She's got insurance. Yes. So then he knew that he was going to have to correct it. So that's when he directed him to issue a citation. And then allow her to leave. And I believe he told the other officer present to uncuff her. So he took all the correct steps to basically unarrest her.
With regard to findings 2 through 7, you also found that he had violated, Officer Akers had violated policy in his refusal to answer questions.
Yes, sir.
Why did you find that?
Well, one reason was he failed to answer a question that Lieutenant Bell posed to him, a follow-up question. The other one was what came up later in this what came up in the investigation that was absent in the in-car camera footage and Sergeant Scott's initial report is all of a sudden there some other violations popped up. It wasn't just he wasn't just arresting her for failure to signal lane change. All of a sudden it was, she was driving, put him in danger, that kind of thing. I believe he brought up speeding through the school zone. It was still active. When Sergeant Scott said, tell me everything you have here, what's going on, that wasn't mentioned. And that's basically when a sergeant or gives you the directive, tell me what's going on. Why are you making this arrest? And you leave out a certain percentage of that, then that's insubordination. You have to tell your sergeant, no, this is what I believe is going on right now. There's really only, two things that could happen. I remember we did discuss this in the pre-disciplinary hearing as well, and there was no answer for that. It was just kind of like, yeah, well, we thought of this afterwards. Well, that's not what we do, right? We don't. You arrest somebody, you arrest them. Your sergeant says, "What are you arresting the subject for?" You tell them all the charges they're getting arrested for. You don't think of some afterwards.
How would you characterize the way that Officer Akers pursued the Trevino vehicle?
It was reckless. That was one of the claims too, is that she had driven recklessly. In that in-car video, no matter how many times you watch it, I think he crosses the double line, passes the vehicle, and then makes a right turn with his sirens on. And I know earlier the question was asked, is it common for some to do a traffic stop with sirens? No. I guarantee it's an extremely high percentage of traffic stops that aren't conducted with sirens. So yes, none of the behaviors that he described were confirmed in that video at all.
Ultimately, why did you, as Chief of Police for the City of New Braunfels, make the determination that you made to give an indefinite suspension to Officer Akers?
Well, not only based on this particular incident, right? Although as the Chief of Police, this is everything that we're not about, right? We don't use our authority to take out personal grudges, right? In any of the categories described there, but also his history, the aggravating circumstances, right? Again, I brought up the progressive discipline in the pre-disciplinary hearing, trying to get a response of like, can you explain this? Why the behavior was not corrected, right? And again, it's as we talk about poor decisions, we tried to correct that with not only written reprimands, temporary suspensions, but also offering every kind of training. Lieutenant Bell went to the training with him. So it's just like the little closing paragraph I had under aggravating circumstances. It's just failure to respond.
Thank you. I'll pass the witness.